This is a great parable. It's one of my favorite parables, and it's a clear instance of a parable where Jesus tells a story that is directly connected with the everyday experience of his listeners, but where it is clearly something that would never happen. So therefore, it's a parable of the kingdom of God. No landowner would ever do what this guy did. And so that's the source of the exaggeration that then makes it not a story about something that happened at the vineyard down the road from where Jesus was teaching, but rather a parable of the kingdom of God. The structure of the parable, it's very clear. The hours of his hiring all the people, first early in the morning, then 9 o'clock, and then noon and 3 and about 5 in the third episode. And in that episode, there's an expansion of what had been, what was present in the earlier episode. Sometimes there's an expansion of an earlier pattern. Sometimes there's a condensation in later repetitions. In this case, Jesus expands it, and it is in order then to give the mouthy landowner more of a chance to mock and deride the laborers who he's hiring. His caustic tone. And then the last part of the parable is about the payment. And so the guys were hired at 5 o'clock. That's the subject of the first episode of the payment. And then, of course, the climax is the anger of those who got the same amount as those who had only worked 1 hour, and they had worked all day. And so the last part of the parable then is his response. And it is a threefold response. I'm doing you no wrong. Then take it and go, because I choose to give to the last the same as I give to you. And then the question, am I not allowed to do what I want with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous? So the structure of this, if you focus on the structure of early, 9 o'clock, noon and 3 and 5, then the argument with those who he hired at 5, and then in the evening, the payment. And it's the last, and then going to the first. The verbal threads in this are primarily, on the one hand, the verbal thread of early in the morning, 9 o'clock, noon, 3 o'clock, and so on. The usual daily wage is a verbal thread that runs through this. The primary verbal thread is they were standing idle in the marketplace in the second episode, and then in the third, he says, why are you standing here idle all day? That becomes a theme. Idle laborers. There are significant translation issues in this parable that you need to be aware of. I don't know that there's any better translation to do, but you can think about it. The first one is the usual daily wage. In Jesus' parable, it is a denarius. And so he says, they agreed for a denarius, and he paid them a denarius, and when the first ones came, they got the denarius. And then the others got, when the ones who had worked all day, they also received a denarius. It's been translated as the usual daily wage because people don't know what a denarius is, but it makes it a little wooden, and it's a lot more words, and so you can make your own choice about that. The other one is more difficult. In the last statement of the landowner is literally, or do you have an evil eye because I am good? Or do you have the evil eye? That is, do you look at this from a hostile perspective because I'm good? And is it because of this? Well, that's really hard to translate. It's never been translated literally that way because the evil eye is not something that is a concept that we have and that carries the meaning that it had in its original context. But are you envious because I'm generous doesn't really do it either. It's not envious that's the issue. It's that they're looking at him from a hostile point of view and are reading into his actions evil that isn't there. And so it's hard to translate. An earlier translation was, or do you begrudge me my generosity? That's another possibility. You can make your own decision about that in relation to what, carries the impact of the story best for you. The most important thing in telling this story is not to hesitate to make the landowner caustic and to have the usual attitude of landowners toward laborers, of seeing them as idle, lazy, and mouthy, and of putting them down in various ways in his attitude toward them. That was the attitude of the landowners of Jesus' day, and Jesus presents it that way. So there is even development of that, so that the listeners to Jesus' parable were probably primarily working men like those who were hired to work in the vineyard. They were the peasants of Galilee, and so they could identify with those who worked all day for a denarius. And the relationships between the peasants and the landowners were hostile then, as they are now between working class and upper class owners and workers. So the key to making this parable interesting is to convey that negative attitude on the part of the landowner toward the laborers, the hostility of the laborers toward him when he doesn't pay them what they think they ought to get, because that burr under the saddle of this story is what drives the listeners to have to think about themselves in relation to the kingdom of God and their sense of they should be paid however much they had worked, and whether that is the way that things are supposed to be in relation to the kingdom. It is a completely unlikely scenario. That is, it is very improbable that an owner in the context of the Galilean vineyards of the first century would have paid guys who only worked 1 hour the same as those who had worked all day. More likely what he would have done was to pay them a tenth of what the ones who got the denarius had been paid. That is, to pay them by the hour, as would happen now. So the shock of the parable is, why did he do that? Why did he pay those only a denarius a day? And that's the point of comparison to, then, the kingdom of God. So this isn't a parable about something that happened at the vineyard down the road. This is a parable about the kingdom of God and the attitude of God toward those who have worked for him, and that it's irrelevant how long they've worked for him. The issue is that they contributed to God's vineyard. So the parable is about a landowner who is the point of comparison with God, who is generous to everybody, who gives to everybody abundantly, and who then has to deal with the jealousy and anger that gets created by people who think they deserve more than everybody else.